Hi, I'm Jan Wegener and I've been a professional photographer and YouTuber for many years, providing you with essential content to help you to level up your own photography game. Whether it's image editing, perfecting your field techniques, or choosing the right gear, I'm here to guide you every step of the way. Recently, I had the chance to spend several days in the field with Sony's latest flagship, the Alpha One Mark II, and we got a lot to unpack. This camera basically delivers on everything we could possibly want in a flagship, yet sometimes I was left wondering what is going on here. So is this the ultimate do-it-all camera, or does it fall short in some key areas? Stick around as we will unpack its biggest strength, surprising weaknesses, and of course we're also going to compare it to the original A1 and the competition. When you grab the A1 Mark II for the first time, you will instantly notice the improved body design and ergonomics. It feels a lot more like the nice and smooth design of the A9 Mark III rather than the sharp edge design of the original A1, and I think that is a major improvement. It's definitely the smallest and lightest flagship camera on the market, with a similar size and weight to the A9 Mark III, and with basically the identical weight to the original A1. And when it comes to the price, the camera actually comes in cheaper than the original A1 and just above the A9 Mark III at $6,299 or 10,990 Australian dollars. The A1 Mark II uses the same VGC5 battery grip we can also use with the A9 Mark III. I didn't have the battery grip when I was using the A1 II in the field, but I would definitely want it, especially with bigger lenses because it lies so much better in your hand and it's also easier to take vertical images. One area I didn't like about the original A1 was the very tight fit between your fingers, the grip and the lens on the right hand side of the camera body. And on the Alpha One Mark II, Sony did not only manage to widen that gap, but also placed the C5 speed boost button that we know from the A9 Mark III in there. So with that improved design, it's now much more comfortable and easier to hold the camera and to work with it, which I think is a fantastic improvement overall. The A1 II also comes with a beautiful 9.2 million dot electronic viewfinder, which is nice and big. You're right there with the action, and it's also super smooth and crisp and just a joy to use in the field. The rear LCD screen comes with a resolution of about 2.1 million dot, which is nothing really to get excited about, but it is the best rear screen on the market by far, because the 4-axis design allows you to basically turn it and tilt it in any way you want, and I love just using it on the A9 III, the A7 IV, and now also the A1 Mark II. The Sony A1 II comes with one of the fastest and most impressive sensors on the market. It's the same sensor that we can also find in the original A1, and it has 50 megapixels, a good dynamic range at high ISOs, and a super fast readout speed of only about 4 milliseconds, which means we basically don't have to deal with rolling shutter at all. When it comes to the speed, the frames per second also remain the same. Both the original A1 and the A1 II can shoot at up to 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. On top of that, the Sony A1 Mark II also comes with Sony's latest AI chip and their latest processors, which should give us improved performance and autofocus. Like most of the high-end Sony cameras, the A1 II comes with 2 card slots that can either take SD cards or the faster CF Express Type A cards. And what I also liked seeing is that the camera will still use the same batteries that you can also use in the original A1 and the A9 Mark III, for instance, so your old batteries won't go to waste. In saying that, it does feel like battery life has taken a little bit of a hit, and if you want to do a full day of intensive shooting, and especially if you use pre-capture and do a lot of video, having 3 to 4 batteries on hand is what you need to get through a full day of shooting, and be sure that you won't run out of batteries. What's fantastic about most Sony cameras, and the A1 II is no exception, is the amount of wheels, buttons and customizable buttons on the camera body. Unlike many brands, and I'm looking at you Nikon, Sony doesn't only have 2 or 3 wheels, they actually have 4 wheels on the camera body, which makes it a joy to use and so much easier to customize the camera, because you can essentially assign anything you want to any button you want and any wheel you want, and then just end up with a camera that works exactly the way that you want it to work. All in all, the design and functionality of the A1 II is great and a fantastic improvement over the original A1. It doesn't only feel better in your hand and sits better in your hand with easier to reach buttons, but you also have a lot more option when it comes to customizing your buttons. Of course, the A1 II also comes with IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and in combination with the image stabilization in the lenses, that gives you the ability to do relatively shake-free handheld video, handheld low shutter speeds, and also gives you a nice and smooth and quite shake-free viewfinder experience. Now, while Sony's IBIS and image stabilization has dramatically improved over the last few years, it still lags behind a little bit against the competition. If you do handheld video, for instance, you will notice that there's a little bit of shaking going on. So to work around that, I would always recommend to use a tripod anyways if you want to film, but if that's not an option, Sony also has some fantastic dynamic active or active stabilization modes in the camera body that crops into your video a little bit, but at the same time makes it a lot more stable. When I got the call from Sony asking whether I wanted to review the A1 Mark II, and of course I wanted to review it and make a video for all of you guys, I was just on my way to Melbourne. And because I knew I would only have the camera for a few days, I needed to find some good spots quickly and also cross my fingers that the weather wouldn't be too bad, because that's something you can never be too sure of in Melbourne. So when I received the camera body and a few lenses a few days later, I quickly set it up similar to how I set up the A9 Mark III and took it out to the local forest where you can usually find some beautiful parrots. The first images I took was of a group of crimson rosellas that were feeding on the ground, and I tried to get some nice head portraits with the 2.8 300mm lens, the A1 Mark II, and the 1.4 extender. And I must admit that 2.8 300mm lens is quickly becoming one of my favorite lenses because it's so lightweight, super sharp, and works really well even wide open with both of the extenders. And on the A1 Mark II, it performed super well. The autofocus was really nice and fast, and also the image quality was very good with super nice and crisp detail. Since I was in the dark rainforest, I had to use reasonably high ISOs of like 3200 or 6400, but looking at the files, I never felt that was much of an issue, and the camera gave me some nice image quality with not too high noise levels. After a little while, I heard a few big thunders right behind me, and it started to rain heavily. So I quickly ran back to the car to seek shelter. But then while sitting in the car and thinking what I should be doing next, I saw these two soaking wet kookaburras sitting in a tree right in front of me. So now I had to make a tough call. Do I stay dry and comfortable in the car, or do I go out in the rain and try to get some more footage? So of course I decided to grab the camera and the lens, and I walked back out into the rain and was able to capture some quite interesting and fun footage of the two birds sitting in a heavy rain. And then suddenly one of the two birds flew into the grass and grabbed a threatened Dandenong burrowing crayfish out of the ground. And even though I had to use high ISOs and then still not had enough shutter speed for the action because it was so dark for the thunderstorms, I got away with some interesting images from this quite unusual encounter. Overall, the image quality of the A1 Mark II seems excellent and very similar to the original A1. And that is no surprise since both of these cameras share the same sensor. So when we look at these files, I think overall the image quality of the A1 Mark II is fantastic and also delivers at these higher ISO levels. At the same time though, I can't give you my final conclusion just yet because most softwares won't work with the files of the Sony A1 Mark II just yet. So I can't really run my normal workflow on the files, and I also can't run any noise reduction on the files. But from what I've seen so far, the image quality seems very good and also very similar to the original A1, and I would expect these files to clean up just as good or a little bit better than the original A1 files. As a nature and bird photographer in particular, you will also appreciate the ability to crop quite heavily if you really have to, because the A1 Mark II, just like the A1, gives us these beautiful 50 megapixel files that still maintain good quality even if we have to be a bit more heavy-handed when it comes to the cropping. This is something that is definitely a great advantage over some other cameras like a Canon R1 or the A9 Mark III, for instance, where with the 24 megapixels we have to be a little bit more careful when it comes to the cropping. The autofocus also did quite a good job in my first few tests in the rainforest. It found the rosellas quite quickly and stayed on them quite well. The only thing I noticed, especially when the subjects were smaller in my frame or if there was a lot of branches or grass near the subjects, that in those cases when using the wide area autofocus, the subject recognition didn't always know what was the bird and had trouble finding it at times. The next day I decided to look for a spectacular bird that lives in a mountain surrounding Melbourne, the flame robin. And I knew the conditions would be tough with probably clouds and quite cold temperatures, so definitely not easy shooting conditions. And after a little bit of searching, I suddenly noticed one orange dot flying from one branch to another. So I went closer, and within a few minutes I was able to get close enough to a beautiful male flame robin. So I spent a little bit of time with that spectacular bird and was able to get some beautiful photos and video footage. Of course, these images required a little bit more editing because the light was quite dark and flat, and I also had to deal with a bit of that haze that the fog was adding to my images. But with the right editing techniques, I was able to get away with one image in particular that I quite liked. And if you guys want to learn how to edit even your most complicated to edit images, I would highly recommend that you check out my Lightroom Masterclass and my Next Generation Photoshop Masterclass. In there, I teach you step by step everything you need to know when it comes to image editing, and with my systematic and easy to follow approach, you will be able to transform your own RAW files into true masterpieces ready to be shared with the world. But don't just take my word for it. Check out the amazing reviews I've already received from many happy customers who were able to totally transform their approach to editing and finally get the results of their dreams. So if you want to turn editing from a frustrating chore into a rewarding experience and learn how to get the most from your images, make sure to check out my Lightroom Masterclass and the Next Generation Photoshop Masterclass down there in the description. Let's talk about the autofocus a little bit more, because on one hand it's fantastic and delivers great results, but on the other hand it sometimes struggles with seemingly easy tasks. Whenever I'm in Melbourne during springtime, I love photographing nesting peregrine falcons in the ocean cliffs. And what better subject is there to test the autofocus system than the fastest bird in the world? Unlike most other peregrine falcon spots that are not the most photogenic, this spot definitely is, and you can also see directly into the nest from a safe distance without disturbing the birds. Even though I had to shoot at a larger distance and use the 2x extender, the image quality was still excellent. The only thing I noticed here is that the A1 II had trouble finding the falcon unless I was using the spot autofocus or a small zone. Whenever I tried to use the wide autofocus where the camera finds your subject all over the viewfinder by itself, it had trouble the first few times to actually identify what's the subject that I want to focus on. Eventually, after repressing the autofocus a bunch of times, it would find it, but initially it always had trouble identifying what is the subject in this frame. Interestingly though, whenever the camera actually identified the falcon as my subject, I let the AF on button go and repressed it, it would instantly jump back to the falcon and not look for all the other areas anymore, almost like it had learned or understood what I actually wanted it to do or what the subject is in this scene. If we compare this side by side with the Canon autofocus from the R5 Mark II or the R1, we can see that the Canon autofocus is a lot more decisive in identifying the subject and instantly jumping onto it. I'm not showing this example to say that one is necessarily better than the other, but in this particular situation, you can see the big difference between the different autofocusing systems. So overall, I had a little bit of a spotty experience when it comes to the subject detection for birds, and I had to use a bit more small zones and spot autofocus than I would have liked ideally. So the autofocus itself and the tracking once a subject is acquired is actually really good, but the initial subject recognition is where it's lacking a little bit, and I'm hopeful that a few more tweaks could be made to improve that in the future. So while the subject recognition is a little bit spotty for perch birds, where the autofocus really shines and gives you remarkable results is when it comes to fast-moving subjects and action. Here the autofocus is able to jump onto your subject right away, track it against a multitude of ever-changing backgrounds, stick with it, and give you fantastic, nice and sharp results. One morning I was sitting at a peregrine falcon nest waiting for the birds to come in and perch right in front of me, when I suddenly noticed the male flying in from a distance, bringing back food to the nest. Now I was set up for perch shots, so I had the 600mm lens on there, the 2x extender, but I thought, why not give it a go? So I cranked up the ISO, cranked up the shutter speed, and started to focus on the bird. It was coming closer and closer, the camera was sticking to it, and then I suddenly noticed at the bottom of my viewfinder, the female peregrine falcon was suddenly approaching the male, trying to snatch the food from its claws. It was actually quite hard to now keep two peregrine falcons in my viewfinder at 1200 millimeters, but I just followed the action, fired away, and was hoping the autofocus would stay on the birds, and it did. And I got some cool shots of the female flying in from underneath the male, basically turning upside down and trying to rip the prey out of his claws and take it to the nest for the babies. Having a camera that could deliver in this situation, giving me such a unique photo, was definitely important, and I was more than happy with it. During my time in Melbourne, I also had the opportunity to visit a wedge-tailed eagle nest. And when I got to the nest, the babies were actually quite active, just training their wings, flapping them up and down to strengthen their muscle so they could soon leave their nest. Sometimes cameras can struggle a fair bit in these situations because whenever the bird flaps the wings, the autofocus will jump from the bird's face onto the wingtip, but the A1 Mark II and the 600mm prime lens on this occasion delivered me some fantastic results, and I got some beautiful footage and also some nice photos. One of the worst things that can happen to you in the field when you're tracking fast moving action firing away is that you suddenly hit the buffer and the camera slows down, or in Canon's case, stops shooting altogether. That can be super frustrating and can miss you crucial moments, but on the A1 Mark II, the buffer definitely seems to be a good size. This is also due to the fact that Sony cameras can shoot indefinitely at a reduced frame rate whenever you hit the buffer, so you're never in a situation where you totally miss all the action. Most of the time I was actually shooting in lossless compressed RAWs and JPEG, and whenever I fired away, I was basically able to get all the shots I needed without having to worry too much about the buffer. Of course, you can eventually hit it and it can become an issue, but in most situations I found it to be more than sufficient, and actually reducing your RAW size to one of the compressed options will increase the buffer and help you to shoot even longer. Another feature that requires a big buffer, and I'm glad to see added to the A1 Mark II, is full RAW pre-capture. And Sony's implementation of this is probably the best on the market, because you can choose the pre-capture amount. So when you half press the shutter button, or optionally also when you press the AF on button, the camera will take anywhere from 0.1 to 1 second of images before you actually fully press the shutter button. So you basically have that little safety buffer or safety net built into the camera that whenever you're a little bit too slow, you still capture all the action once you finally hit that shutter button. My preferred settings when it comes to the pre-capture are usually 0.2 or 0.3 seconds. That gives me 6 or 9 extra images, and that's just enough time that whenever I'm a little bit too slow in the field, I'm still getting the action without taking too many images by setting it to 0.5 or 1 second. When it comes to video, the A1 II offers us some fantastic options and great quality. We can choose from a large variety of resolutions all the way up to 8K 30 frames per second or 4K up to 120 frames per second. If we compare that to the original A1, we can see that most things, especially when it comes to the resolution and frame rate, have essentially stayed the same. But since both cameras share the same sensor, that is to be expected. However, there's definitely great improvements when it comes to the overall video capabilities of the A1 Mark II. For instance, now we can shoot in S-Log3, which gives us higher dynamic range. And most importantly, and what I was super excited to see, is that Sony has finally added more subject detection modes to their video autofocus. On the original A1, you could only track humans, whereas now on the new camera, you have a lot more different subject detection modes for birds, for instance, and many other subjects, which makes working with the camera so much easier in the field. And I'm happy to say that this works really well and is one of the dramatic improvements of the A1 Mark II over the original A1. There's just one thing that annoys me when using the A9 Mark III or the A1 Mark II now in the field, and that is when I switch from photo to video mode, that the autofocusing area remains the same. You can go into the menu and select a lot of other settings that you want to have separate for photo and video, but that doesn't include the autofocusing area, and that makes it a little bit annoying for me to use in the field. Now I could set up custom functions to work around this issue, but what I would ideally want to do is to have one autofocusing area and settings and mode in photo. And then when I switch over to video, I want to have a different set of autofocusing areas and settings for video. And at the moment, that is not possible. So whatever I have set up in photo in terms of the autofocusing area will also be defaulted to when I switch to video. And then if I change it in video mode and switch back to photo, I will now have the autofocusing settings that are dialed in video in the photo mode. So ideally, I would like Sony to address this so that we can have separate autofocusing areas and modes for photo and for video. Definitely not a deal breaker, but not a smooth workflow when it comes to working with the camera in the field. I really enjoy what the A1 Mark II has to offer when it comes to filming with it. Now having the subject tracking makes it a lot easier to work with it, and also having nice and fast video autofocus that tracks our subjects very well helps a lot. And of course, the files themselves also look very nice and are quite easy to color grade. Overall, the Sony A1 Mark II brings the Alpha 1 series cameras up to modern day flagship standard. It delivers a great combination of a top-notch sensor, raw pre-capture, fast frame rates, and fantastic video features, all packed into a well-designed body. What more could you ask for? And paired with an A9 Mark III, this would be a fantastic 1-2 punch for any photographer. That said, I wish Sony would have pushed the frame rate just a little bit higher, maybe 40 or even 50 frames per second. Now 30 frames per second is still fantastic and plenty fast in most situations, and if you need ultimate speed you still have the A9 Mark III, but it would have been exciting to see Sony push the boundaries and give us a camera that has the 50 megapixel and insane speed. However, I'm not sure whether that's even technically possible at the moment, but one can dream, right? What really stands out to me and what I'm only realizing now is how good the sensor in the A1 and now the A1 Mark II actually is. It's already basically 4 years old, but it has still not been surpassed to this date. It's the only sensor that gives us high megapixels, high frames per second, super fast readout speed, no rolling shutter, and good dynamic range at the high ISO levels. A lot of other manufacturers have some of these things, but they don't have it all combined in the one sensor. And this is also the main reason I think Sony decided to stick with this sensor. First of all, it's that good. And secondly, it may just not be currently possible to make a sensor that is much better or much faster or has much higher megapixels. So all in all, it's a fantastic camera with a fantastic sensor that will make many photographers and filmmakers very happy. Are you one of them? If you are, or you aren't, or you have anything else to say about the camera or this video, make sure to let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my channel membership and my new masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys in another video very soon. Bye!